Good afternoon, and welcome to this webinar on Hamas, Iran, and the future of jihadism after October 7th. My name is Jacob Olidort. I'm Director of Research at the Gemunder Center for Defense and Strategy here at the Jewish Institute for National Security of America, JINSA. This webinar is part of a series of resources JINSA has been publishing on Israel at war since the very beginning, since October 7th. To access all of our resources, including our previous webinars, op-eds, and long-form analysis, please visit our website at jinsa.org, JINSA.org. Before introducing our panelists today, I'd like to make two quick housekeeping announcements. The first, we will be taking questions from you, our listeners and viewers, at roughly half past the hour. If you have a question for the panelists at any time during this webinar, please enter it into the Q&A function on your screens. The second, I'd like to make you aware of two other webinars we have planned for this week. The first will be on Wednesday, January 10th at 2:00 p.m. Eastern Time, where our President and CEO, Dr. Mike Makovsky, will hold a conversation with retired General Kenneth McKenzie, the former commander of the United States Central Command and a 2023 JINSA Generals and Admirals Program participant. Later in the week, we will also have a webinar, a Gaza War Update webinar. So please stay tuned for invitations to those events in your inboxes. I'm pleased to welcome today two scholars of jihadism who've been working extensively on this subject and who are joining us, Cole Bunzel and Aaron Zelin. Cole Bunzel is a research fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. He is a scholar who's published widely on Sunni jihadism and is the author of a new book, Wahhabism, the History of a Militant Islamic Movement. He received his MA in International Relations from Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies and his BA and PhD in Near Eastern Studies from Princeton University. He also served as a research fellow in Islamic Law and Civilization at the Yale Law School and is a non-resident fellow at the George Washington University Program on Extremism. Cole is also the editor of Jihadika, a website blog with analysis on the latest trends in jihadism. Aaron Zelin is the Levy Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, where he also directs the Islamic State Worldwide Activity Map Project. Aaron is also a visiting research scholar in the Department of Politics at Brandeis University and founder of the websites Jihadology and Mukawamology, which have primary sources relating to different jihadist groups, as well as to Hamas. And I've been privileged to rely on both websites in my research. They're really treasures for scholars in the field. He's the author of the book, Your Sons Are at Your Service, Tunisia's Missionaries of Jihad with Columbia Press, and is working on a book currently on jihadism in Syria, tentatively titled Heartland of the Believers, A History of Syrian Jihadism. Cole, Aaron, thank you both for your time and for joining us today. My first question is for Cole. You wrote a very important article for Foreign Affairs in early November where you surveyed the reactions from different jihadist groups from al-Qaeda to ISIS, their perceptions of both Hamas and its barbaric attack on October 7th. If you would please summarize for our viewers and listeners your observations in that piece, and especially it'd be helpful if you gave some context about why that's important in the context of their prior perceptions of Hamas, as well as what it means after that event.
Well, first of all, thank you, Jacob, for having me on, and it's good to be with you, Aaron, as well. Yeah, I wrote this piece for Foreign Affairs because in the aftermath of the October 7th attack, there was a lot of commentary to the effect that Hamas equals ISIS. And I don't have any objection to the idea that on a moral level, what Hamas did on October 7th was evocative of some of the worst atrocities that ISIS ever committed. And so in that sense, Hamas does equal ISIS. But on a more analytical level, I think it's important that we understand that ISIS, as well as al-Qaeda, they belong to a different tendency within the broader Sunni Islamist movement that really comes into formation in the early 20th century. So Hamas has its origins in the Muslim Brotherhood. It was formed in 1987 as a Palestinian resistance movement. Its charter quotes Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, saying that we are going to eliminate the state of Israel. Al-Qaeda and ISIS belong to a movement that is predicated on the idea that the the standing regimes in the Middle East, particularly the Arab regimes, they are regimes of apostasy and unbelief and polytheism, and they have to be eradicated. They have to be uprooted and replaced with proper Islamic states. And that's not the view of groups like Hamas, which are much more willing to operate in the normal international arena, the political environment. They'll recognize states like Egypt and Syria, et cetera. And as we've seen, they're willing to cooperate with Iran. So there have been lots of disagreements between these groups. There was a long time actually when the jihadis were and they come into formation really in the 70s and 80s and 90s. The jihadis were able to kind of see Hamas as something that we can tolerate, that we'll support because they're fighting the Jews, and they're fighting jihad against people we also see as our enemy. So you have as late as 2001 comments by Osama bin Laden saying that Hamas is fighting our fight. We are together with them. But there comes a point in 2006, of course, after Israel withdraws from Gaza, that Hamas enters into these elections, the Palestinian legislative elections. And by entering into those elections, according to the jihadis, Hamas was recognizing the Oslo Accords, was thereby recognizing Israel's right to exist. It was showing its true colors as a Palestinian nationalist movement, not really an Islamic movement. And therefore, it was committing the sin not only of recognizing Israel, but also entering into these polytheistic, as they understand it, democratic elections. In their version of Sunni Islamism, democracy is shirk, it is kufr, it is unbelief, it is polytheism, and those who enter into it are not to be considered Muslims, especially not mujahideen, people fighting jihad. So that's the beginning, really, of this tiff that you see between the jihadis and Hamas, and it gets much worse soon after that, because there's an event, I think, in 2009 when you had a jihadi group led by a man named Abu Nur al-Maqdisi, who declared an Islamic Emirate in southern Gaza, and this was basically Hamas took care of that problem and killed the leader. So you had all of this discussion on jihadi websites and forums about some people said that Hamas through and through they were an apostate group. Others said no, we have to distinguish between the military side of Hamas, that's the al-Qassam brigades, and the so-called political wing of Hamas. And to say that the political wing, they're unbelievers because they recognize the Palestinian Authority and they've entered into elections, but the military wing, we can consider them mujahideen, will support them. That essentially became the position of al-Qaeda, which was clarified by 2009, that they are not going to support Hamas, but they are going to support the al-Qassam brigades. And you see that in the reactions so far to the October 7th attack, and in response to the ongoing war. Al-Qaeda in its statements, both the Al-Qaeda central statements and the statements of its various branches, have all been very clear to avoid using the term Hamas. It's like Voldemort, Beetlejuice. You can't say it, because if you acknowledge that Hamas is the actual party there, then you're identifying with something, you're exhibiting the incoherence of your ideology. But they will refer to the Al-Qassam brigades and support them. However, there are ideologues, or scholars, if you prefer, who belong to the jihadi movement, such as Abu Muhammad al-Maqdisi in Jordan, who do not acknowledge this distinction between the so-called military and political wings. And they are having a very hard time kind of, they want to support the jihad, but it doesn't fit into their ideological worldview. So there's this kind of, wishy-washiness about how Al-Qaeda is been able to sort of talk about this war. For ISIS, it's a lot easier because they regard Hamas as through and through apostates, and they have a more severe interpretation of the jihadi ideology, which allows for no toleration of any member of Hamas. They're all unbelievers, and so when it comes to approaching this war, that they say that basically neither side is to be supported. Of course, they identify with the Muslims of Gaza. But those do not include the people who are working for Hamas, who identify with Hamas. who are fighting for Hamas. So they don't really have a side in this fight. And a lot of their commentary going back as far as the era of Abu Musab al-Zarqawi in the late 2000s, the later 2000s, was to the effect that the war in Palestine, the war for Jerusalem, is something kind of a ways off. And that sort of narrative about how we're going to approach this fight for in Israel, that it's fairly continuous, it's fairly consistent, and you don't see much of a of an emphasis on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in the discourse of ISIS, the way that you do see it much more clearly in the discourse of al-Qaeda. And so basically, what I set out in that piece is to show that, because of these ideological distinctions and differences, it's going to be hard for the jihadi movement to seize this to seize on this war to re-energize itself. I do suspect, and as we have seen, there have been attacks, kind of lone wolf style attacks by those who support al-Qaeda and ISIS in Europe, in the West, but so far it hasn't really amounted to a kind of a new phase of the global jihadi movement.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. And obviously, I know we'll get to that in a little bit. I mean, but obviously, the very fact that, the whole jihad on behalf of a secular concept, such as a nation state, in the eyes of ISIS is illegitimate. I think that's a very important doctrinal piece that probably is less awkward for al-Qaeda. And I never thought about the Beetlejuice Voldemort comparison. But yeah, that. Obviously, October 7th, I mean, for Hamas, Aaron, has been a big, an important branding opportunity, a different moment for the group, and they've been very vocal and consistent in their messaging. They've been hosting press briefings in Beirut. I don't know how often those are happening now with Aruri out of the picture, but tell us a little bit, if you will, Aaron, how Hamas has been maneuvering ideologically and physically and ideologically here in the post October 7th environment, both within Gaza and then beyond Gaza.
Yeah, it is interesting that the overt press conferences that they're having in Beirut has actually stopped in the last week or so. I don't know if it has to do with the killing of Salah Haruri or anything else. That being said, many of their leaders are still showing up on, Al Jazeera almost on a daily basis, if not more. But there has been an evolution in the way that they've discussed the attacks and subsequently what has happened since October 7th. In the beginning, in the immediate 24, 36, 48 hours, maybe, there was a lot of boasting about the attack and excitement around what they accomplished and did and how they're able to pull it off and essentially tricking the Israeli military and the like, surprising the intelligence services and so on and so forth. In their videos that they're putting out, they're showing all the hang gliders, they're showing themselves breaking the fence, going into the different kibbutzim in Israel, as well as shooting a bunch of people randomly, as well as a lot of other types of violence. I'm sure some on the video, I've seen some of these videos online. However, quickly, as they realized that there was sort of this negative press against what they actually did, considering how horrific it was, you started to see a lot of obfuscating the reality of it, gaslighting people, saying that, we didn't kill any civilians, we only targeted Israeli military, essentially. We weren't involved in any, raping women, mutilating bodies, so on and so forth. And therefore, they stopped posting any videos related to the actual 10/7 attack, and instead started just showing rocket attacks they're launching towards Israel. It's important to remember that these are still directed at civilians, since they're not, targeted towards any specific military installation. And the thing too is that they, started sort of redirecting the blame for everything on Israel then as well. Anything that they perceived as hurting Israel's PR, so on and so forth, they would highlight in their own messaging. And in particular, they would translate their Arabic statements into English when it had something to do with like a journalist being killed or maybe something happening at a hospital, something along those lines where there was a mass casualty event in an operation that Israel might have conducted against civilians within Gaza itself. And therefore, not only were they trying to spread this message to obviously the audience within the Arab world, but by translating these statements into English that were particularly related to civilian death, it would raise awareness amongst, younger Westerner individuals that might be interested in supporting Hamas, because they're seen by many that are on the far left as, this resistance movement, this anti-colonial movement against Israel. You also sort of saw a shift as Israel's military campaign continued, and a lot of Hamas's capabilities started to be degraded. That for a while, a lot of it was focused on all these rocket attacks that they're, doing against the border areas, against Israel. But more recently, in the past few weeks or so, as that's gotten degraded and it's been harder for them to shoot rockets, though there still are rockets, just not in the same pace or scale. You see it more just traditional counterinsurgent attacks where they're showing themselves blowing up a tank or a car of Israeli soldiers, or maybe when they're booby trapping a tunnel that they previously put explosives in, and so on and so forth. And then finally, one aspect of the messaging that's really picked up, especially since the negotiations over hostages has fallen by the wayside, is that there's a lot of psychological warfare related to the hostage dealing, where they'll put out messages of distressed Israelis in captivity, and they'll put it out in Hebrew, so that it will affect the public conversation within Israel itself. And increasingly, they've been doing this with women. They've done it with children. They've also done it with the elderly. Even sometimes they've shown bodies of Israelis that they captured that have since died. They claim that Israel killed them while they're bombed, though it's likely that they themselves killed these individuals while they've been in captivity. So there's been different layers of this over time, and it'll be interesting to see how this sort of evolves as Israel now changes from, I think it was either phase 2 to phase 3 or phase 3 to phase 4 in its military campaign, where it's not as bombardment in the way that they're bombing segments of Gaza at this point.
No, it's really, I had the privilege, I guess, to bear witness to the October 7th atrocities, and it's difficult to watch, but it's also psychologically hard to comprehend how much they publicize it. And it's clear that they took their cue from ISIS, that they thought this would be a big branding opportunity, but just clearly they're sort of recalibrating based on that, but still not letting up on just how brutally they're messaging about it. Just very, very difficult. I want to turn on a related topic to both of you. Really since the beginning, but especially in recent weeks, Hamas officials have been fairly vocal about threats of attack against Americans and others in Europe. How credibly should we take these threats? How serious are they? Do they have the capacity and really momentum to stage something? I mean, there have been one-off attacks. There was one in Berlin a couple of weeks ago, but will they be able to stage something on the likes on the scale of what al-Qaeda and ISIS have done in recent years? Your thoughts?
It's a tough. I mean, I've seen some of these statements. There's particularly one by, I think, a guy named it might be Sari Abu Zuhra, Hamas official, I think based in Qatar, talking to maybe Al Jazeera, saying that the price of this war is not going to be paid just by Netanyahu in Israel. It has to be paid by Blinken and by America, by the West, and basically threatening terrorist attacks against Americans, much like what al-Qaeda and ISIS are saying needs to be done. And we've seen a couple of instances, maybe more than a couple, several of plots that have been thwarted in Europe. There was also a plot thwarted recently in Argentina. So I think that this is a growing threat that has to be taken very seriously, but it also has to be recognized that this does come against a background of Hamas never having successfully carried out an external operation in the West. At least, maybe Aaron can correct me. I think that's correct. So while the threat is real, and I don't think that Hamas so far has a kind of proven track record of being able to carry out such an attack.
Yeah, I find a lot of it just rhetorical at this point. There was one plot broken up like maybe 15 or 20 years ago in the United States related to Hamas, but most of Hamas's activities within the West is primarily financial in nature or raising awareness and propaganda to get the support of younger Western individuals to its cause so that that will then put pressure on the local governments in whichever particular Western government. Um, that said, anything could change. I mean, just because Hamas isn't plotting doesn't mean Hezbollah isn't. We've already seen two Hezbollah plots in South America related to the post-10/7 attacks. And, Hezbollah has been plotting within Europe and the United States going back years. Whether one, goes through, hopefully not. But it's more likely within this, resistance network that Iran kind of pulls that it would be more likely from Hezbollah or the IRGC than Hamas at this point. That being said, because there is sort of this congruence between, these messagings against the West, it wouldn't be surprising that somebody that might support Hamas and feels that they want to do more than just typing on the internet or going to some protest, that they might seek out a group like al-Qaeda or ISIS down the road, because there is a long tail to this, in my opinion, because they are the ones that are actually calling for something along those lines in a direct manner and have a history of it too. It's important to remember that a number of people, especially in the Arab world, were mobilized by the Second Intifada and what happened then, and then ended up becoming foreign fighters in Iraq while the U.S. was there post 2003 as well. So it wouldn't be surprising if in the medium to long term, there are broader consequences to this that might not manifest specifically related to Hamas, but in turn could lead somebody to end up becoming even more radicalized and therefore go down sort of the rabbit hole of ISIS.
I just want to add, I've noticed that some of the ways in which ISIS and al-Qaeda have been trying to frame their war as part of this, as part of a response to what's going on in Gaza, it strikes me as very performative. We saw, I think today, a series of missiles that ISIS was firing kind of into the sky. It said that they were going to hit a Malian airbase, and they wrote on the side of the missiles in Arabic, Fetran the Muslimin in Gaza, in revenge for the Muslims of Gaza, as if they're the Malian military is Zionist or something like that. I mean, it's really kind of weird.
Yeah. Well, no, sorry, Aaron, did you want to say something? No, I think that's a great segue into my next question. So obviously, it's hard to have this webinar without addressing ISIS, and especially its actions last week. And so, of course, a very significant, I would say symbolically, moment where ISIS stages an attack or claims an attack that on the eve of the strike that killed Qasem Soleimani at his grave, the attack killed 84 people, injured others. Tell us, both of you, I mean, is this a sign of more involvement by ISIS? What does it say about how it's engaging right now?
I mean, I think it's a pattern that they've been having against Iran for a number of years now. I'm unsure it's specifically related to anything post-10/7. This is the third attack that IS has been able to successfully conduct within Iran now in the last 15 months. And over the last, 6-7 years, Iran has broken up IS-related plots every few months. So it's just a continuation of their campaign. Back in maybe 2017, these would have emanated out of networks related to IS in Iraq and Syria, whereas the stuff in recent years is more related to networks from IS in Afghanistan. And this one, again, is more probably IS in Afghanistan related, especially since the suicide bombers were from Tajikistan originally, which is right north of Afghanistan. But beyond that, IS has very little it can actually do against Israel at this juncture. They did try and start a front from Gaza against Israel back in like 2014, 2015 or so. However, because, as Cole noted, they ideologically are different than Hamas, they also attacked Hamas a ton. And then Hamas cracked down upon them. And by 2017 or so, the network within Gaza itself was more or less destroyed. I imagine that there are still supporters within Gaza, but because of the tight security against them by Hamas, it's hard for them to operate. Otherwise, they'll likely be jailed, tortured, if not killed. Um, there have been 3 arrests by Israel of IS-supported individuals within Israel itself since 10/7. So there clearly are some people that have, tried to do something on behalf of IS, though I wouldn't say that these are IS-directed attacks. They're more akin to sort of the inspired attacks we would see within the Western context, I would argue. Though again, going back to 2015 or so, we've seen a number of inspired related IS plots within Israel itself. Unfortunately, they've actualized about 3 or 4, I think, attacks since 2015 within Israel. But beyond that, the Israeli security services more or less been able to stop that. And then when you look at the northern border region, I mean, IS in Lebanon is not really anything at all, if it was ever. And then within Syria, they're operating in an area that's not on the border with Israel. They're closer to the border with Iraq, so it's less of an issue. I mean, the issue at the border in Syria is more related to Hezbollah and Iranian-backed proxy networks than any jihadis.
Yeah, I would just say that when it comes to the attack last week in Iran, the ISIS attack that killed, I think, some 80 people. A lot of there are a lot of observers who are trying to kind of understand this through the prism of what's going on in between Israel and the Palestinians, and the resistance axis, if you want to call it that, more broadly. And I think that's kind of a mistaken way to look at it. I think Aaron's right. You have to understand that this is part of a pattern of attacks, has more to do with Central Asia, with the ISIS network that's been not necessarily growing there, but that has taken root. There have been less claimed attacks by this group, Islamic State Khorasan province in eastern Afghanistan, over the last year or two than in previous years. But that doesn't seem to mean that the group has been completely subdued, and it's been growing a external operations arm. Its ideological kind of output is very sectarian, very anti-Shiite. One of the main talking points against the Taliban is its protection of what they call the rejectionists, the Shia, in Afghanistan. So, going after Shiite targets, getting the Taliban to condemn such an attack as it did. And the Taliban wants good relations with Iran, it wants to be part of the UN, and Islamic State Khorasan province, which has different from all the other branches. I believe this is correct. Of all the other branches or so-called provinces of the Islamic State, it has its own media operations, which Islamic State's central media operations have not sort of cracked down upon. There used to be this idea that we only accept, anything from when it comes to, attack claims or ideological literature or whatever. We only accept that from the central Islamic State apparatus. But ISK has really established something of its own in multiple languages. I mean, Aaron has cataloged a lot of this: Tajik, Pashto, Persian, Arabic, a lot in English, surprisingly, and idiomatic English. So there's a real threat there that has very little to do with what's going on all the way in the Eastern Mediterranean.
No, thank you both. Just turning to audience questions, one we received. So is there any way, it's clear that there are significant divisions between Hamas and ISIS. I mean, is there any way we can exploit these? And we're obviously in the enemy camp from their perception. So how do we, take advantage of those differences? It's question number one. And then another follow-up, which is related, is there any ISIS-affiliated presence in Gaza or elsewhere on Israel's borders that can make a meaningful threat here?
I mean, I don't think we want to affiliate ourselves with ISIS against Hamas. They're both extremely odious organizations for a variety of reasons. Like I said, ISIS tried to have a presence in Gaza 2014, 2015, they attacked Israel, but they also attacked Hamas. But Hamas was able, after a few years, to more or less crack down on the elements within the Gaza Strip. There are likely still supporters of the group there, but they're more or less deterred at this point. There's, of course, the IS branch in the Sinai province, or that they call the Sinai province in the Sinai Peninsula next door. Um, though I would say that the Sinai province isn't quite as strong as it used to be a number of years ago. The Egyptian military has degraded a lot of their capabilities over the years. They've shot some rockets over the border from the Sinai into Israel a couple of times over the years, but overall, it's not a large scale threat at this point. I mean, if you look at IS as a whole, a lot of the core branches that they had that were threatening Israel or just the region in general and the Levant and North Africa are just not what they used to be, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years ago now. The strongest activities of IS these days is primarily in sub-Saharan Africa and Mali, Burkina Faso, Nigeria, Mozambique, etc., as well as the external operations of ISKP from Afghanistan. So while they're clearly supporters still of the group in the Levant, it's nowhere near what it used to be in terms of like a direct threat to Israel. I would say that Iran's proxy resistance network is far more of a strategic threat, whereas IS is more of a tactical threat to Israel.
Yeah, as far as the kind of trying to exploit the division there between ISIS and Hamas, I think it's best if the United States and the West sort of sit back and allow it to exploit itself, because this division is genuine, and it doesn't need really our interference. And as Aaron said, ISIS in the Levant and the area around Israel all the way to Iraq is really not as big a presence anymore. So I mean, there could come a day when Hamas has been militarily defeated in Gaza, when there are ISIS remnants that try to, you know, seize the stage and be the main opposition force to the occupying Israelis. And so we could have a scenario in the future where the jihadis kind of come to the fore. But for now, that it's Hamas that is the greater threat to Israel, of course. And as Aaron said, it's the Iranian-led so-called resistance axis that is the main kind of strategic threat to the American-led order in the region. And I think that needs to be understood. Unfortunately, our stated strategic basis for being in places like Syria and Iraq is the so-called counter ISIS mission. But we find ourselves not so much at war with ISIS right now in either Iraq or Syria, but with the pro-Iran Shia militias that are firing rockets at our forces and that we are returning fire at. So I think it's hard, perhaps, for the American public to come to terms with what is the real threat right now.
That's very interesting and a little bit harrowing to think about the day after in Gaza that ISIS could regroup there. It wouldn't be the first time that they jumped into a vacuum potentially. So interesting. I do want to turn a little bit more specifically to the threats that Israel faces now, especially to the north. Aaron, obviously this is something you're studying now as part of your project. We talk about the northern front rather, being the potential next front in this war. We think most of the time about Hezbollah, but of course there is Syria and the different jihadi groups there. I think the answer is no, based on what you said earlier, that these groups might not be as focused or prioritizing attacking Israel. But I wonder if you could maybe elaborate a little bit more on how the civil war, which remains unresolved in Syria, would affect Israel. And then a second part to that is looking, which you mentioned, the Iranian proxies in the region. Especially now we're seeing Iraqi militias fire into Israel. Tell our viewers and listeners a little bit about the threats Israel faces on its northern border.
Yeah, I mean, for now with Syria in particular, it's been relatively quiet. Though I saw in the news just before we got on, maybe an hour or so before, that Israel just conducted an airstrike against, I think, Hamas or Hezbollah operative within Syria. So I don't know how that will change the calculus, but For now, it's been relatively quiet because Russia doesn't want it to be a loud open front. I think part of that is they're worried that if something emanates from Syria, that Israel will hit back at the Assad regime, and Russia wants to secure Assad in power, and therefore Assad's kind of been tamping down to make sure that Iran, its proxies, and Hezbollah in southern Syria do not do anything over the border. Whether that changes, obviously, it's hard to say. But for now, that's sort of the stated strategy. In terms of, the broader swath of this campaign by these proxy militias, the main actor in this really has been the Islamic Resistance of Iraq, which is essentially just a consortium of a few different Iranian proxy groups like Kataib Sayyid al-Shuhada, Kataib Hezbollah, as well as some other smaller factions. They've been primarily targeting the U.S. in both Iraq and Syria from Iraq, but some of their missile attacks have, targeted Israel as well, whether in the Eastern Mediterranean Sea or towards Haifa or maybe even Eilat. I don't think any of the missiles that directed that far away actually made it that far. They're likely shot down ahead of time, either by the US or Israel. But it does show that they do have ambitions potentially beyond just the Iraq and Syria theater. Part of this is also part of a broader strategy that Iran and these groups have had going back to the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003, where they want the U.S. to withdraw. So they want to put pressure on the U.S. to leave Iraq, to leave Syria, and therefore, essentially, they'll have the whole space for themselves, and therefore they can prioritize even more resources towards fighting Israel. So I think that by targeting the U.S., it's related to their longer-term plans, potentially, of sort of surrounding Israel to fight them in the long term. So that's sort of where it is now. Yeah.
It's a very interesting observation that the attacks launched against Israel are actually intended to send a message to the United States by these groups and vice versa. So I think that'll be something to watch as well in the coming weeks. Cole, what do you think?
Well, I think when it comes to Hezbollah, with the pattern we've seen from the speeches and the statements by the leadership there are to the effect that we're going to retaliate. We're going to take this very seriously, but at the end of the day, we're not going to open a full-fledged northern front against Israel. And I think that determination has been made in Tehran. And Hezbollah is really an extension of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps and its interests in the region. It wants to have Hezbollah and its 150,000 or so rockets facing Israel as something of a shield against an Israeli attack on Iran itself. And so if you allow there to be a war that potentially jeopardizes the existence of Hezbollah, that opens the door potentially to an Iranian and even an American attack on Iran itself. So I think that there's a great deal of reluctance here on the part of Iran to allow this front to open. But it's there could be one step that Israel takes that is too much for Hezbollah, but including this recent airstrike. I don't know the context. I haven't seen any explanation for why this leader was killed when he was, but it does seem like for now there is something of a red or yellow light being shown from Tehran toward Hezbollah.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. Something to watch. A question, maybe Aaron, we know a bit about the funding of Hamas and Hezbollah. Where are these militias getting their funding from?
There's a combination of things. One, just like Hamas and Hezbollah, part of their budgets are coming from Iran directly, the IRGC in particular. And two, many of these militias post 2014, after the fight against ISIS started, were folded into the Iraqi state within the military apparatus. So they're actually making money through various corruption schemes from the Iraqi government.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Yeah, that makes sense kind of on the local level. Shifting a little bit to both of you. So obviously Israel has fundamentally changed its approach from prior to October 7th to post October 7th, we would describe pre-October 7th as mowing the grass. So basically, Israel would sort of try to deter terrorists on its borders by, striking and dismantling just enough so that they are dissuaded from launching attacks. Obviously, that's shifted, and now they basically no longer tolerate the presence of terrorists altogether on its borders. And we're seeing that in Gaza, we're seeing that in Lebanon and Syria. I would say, very strategic strikes against IRGC officials, Hamas and Hezbollah operatives and leadership. A lot of this is obviously echoes of the U.S. counterterrorism approach over the last 20 years. What lessons do you think Israel would take from that experience, and especially as you look at how the different jihadi groups over the last 20 years have responded to this, say, decapitation approach? Maybe start with Aaron and Nicole.
I mean, it's hard to compare things completely just because Israel's literally surrounded by its enemies, whether in Gaza or in the north, whereas the US is kind of coming from afar into the region itself. The Israelis can't go anywhere. We can kind of pack up our bags as we did in Afghanistan and just come home, and more or less, thankfully and luckily, nothing's happened thus far. So I think that there are different ways of dealing with this. I mean, over the last 20 years, the US has sort of come up with a strategy that more or less has been fine-tuned and, been perfected in relation to a law enforcement approach domestically, intelligence sharing with our various allies globally. And then when necessary, we'll train and equip different allies in the region to fight forces locally themselves, and provide advice as well as intelligence. And then when the US can only do something themselves, they might do a drone strike or a special operations type of activity. But the environment's much different for the US than Israel. I mean, even if Israel sort of clears the Hamas governance project from Gaza, there'll still be supporters of Hamas within Gaza after the fact. There will still be Hamas supporters in the West Bank, for that matter. We're not even talking about the West Bank. So it's a different type of issue, and therefore it needs to be more discriminate and targeted in some ways than just punishing everybody just because they might live in a particular location. I think it's smart to go after those responsible for certain activities. I mean, if you look at the polling data related to Gaza ahead of the 10/7 attacks, the majority of people didn't actually like Hamas because they actually lived under them for, was it 16 or 17 years? So I think that that's important to keep in mind also. The whole, obviously hearts and mind isn't everything, but I think, it's also an important part of things if they want to have a sustainable solution to a lot of this in the longer term. I mean, at least from my perspective and an American perspective, having a peaceful resolution in the longer term is the best thing for both Israel and Palestinians. And the cycle of violence hasn't really solved anything at this juncture. So I think that's important to keep in mind as well.
I think it's a very hard question. I was at a dinner last night with former Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, who was visiting California. And one of the points he made is that you in America, your neighbors are Canada and Mexico. In Israel, our neighbors are Hezbollah and Hamas. So things are a little different for Israel. And I think that there are limits to what, the United States and its wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, what sort of lessons can be drawn from that. And the United States can afford to basically decapitate the regimes of Iraq, Afghanistan, allow, not really come to any great outcome and then withdraw because we are a world away. Israel doesn't have that luxury. In terms of trying to come to a long-term solution, I don't think that the Israeli public is currently in any has really a whole lot of tolerance for the idea of pursuing a two-state solution. I think maybe as a long-term possibility. I don't think there's an opposition to that, but in the short term, that's not something that registers. When it comes to I'm kind of confused about this because there does seem to be something of a paradigm shift in Israeli strategic thinking about what are you going to do with groups that are poised on our borders and that are pledged to our destruction? Are we going to tolerate them? Are we going to allow Qatari money or Iranian money to build them up, and maybe they'll realize that having their territory, that's something that will be satisfactory to them. In the case of Gaza, of course, they've said no more. We're not going to tolerate that, and we're not going to allow Hamas to exist. But in the case of Hezbollah, it's kind of a different animal. It's an extension, as I said, of the IRGC. It's a much more powerful military threat, and if Israel is determined to attack and eliminate Hezbollah the way that they have shown that they are going to do with Hamas, it would be a real drain on the economy, of course, of a very small country. Great deal of resources would need to be committed, and even more kind of political capital in the world could be squandered. So I'm not sure that political shift is going to take place with respect to Hezbollah, at least not in the near term. But we shall see.
See, yeah, no, all lots to think about and consider. Another, I guess, easy question, but based on an earlier point, Cole, that you mentioned about potential day after scenario in Gaza, day after, I should say, risk in a day after scenario of Gaza, of a potential ISIS outpost cropping up. I mean, what should Israeli, American, other international planners consider, especially in the most resource sustainable way, in terms of mitigating or eliminating that kind of a threat of, in a day after scenario, of other terrorist groups jumping into the fold and exploiting it, whether in Gaza or elsewhere?
I think that again is an extremely difficult problem, and it's something that the Israelis will have to try to come to some sort of consensus about. There doesn't seem to be any so far about what the day after, so-called day after, is going to look like in Gaza. I mean, one plan would have something of a multinational peacekeeping force that would include Gulf states. I don't think that's actually, practical. I don't think the Gulf states want to put their forces anywhere near Hamas. So they don't want to be the targets of terrorist attacks, and then be, more sort of identified with Israel and Zionism. So, it's going to be, I think, a very difficult future for Gaza, for Israel. Community building, rebuilding, and there will be, I think, residual terrorist attacks. I doubt that. It could be completely wrong, but I doubt that they will be dominated by ISIS. I think it will be more the remnants of Hamas that will be staging most of the attacks. It will be interesting to see whether the attacks will take place against just Jewish targets, or whether they will be against those seen as collaborators.
That is interesting to watch. Yeah, Aaron, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, it'll be very difficult no matter what, especially because a lot of the urban environment's been destroyed, and therefore there's a lot of places that Hamas and related groups could potentially hide when planning and ambushing attacks in the future. Just think of how chaotic it was in Iraq after the U.S. invaded in 2003, and the violence in Fallujah, or even more recently, in 2017 in the campaign in Mosul. And the thing too is that it's likely that as a consequence of all the people that have been killed over the last few months, that there will be new recruits to Hamas as well. So we're not just talking about the number of people that might have been hardcore supporters and part of the Qassam brigades, prior to 10/7, but it's quite likely that there's a whole fresh crop of new individuals that are signing up to get involved now, just because of revenge purposes, maybe not even ideologically speaking. So that's something to consider as well.
Another distinguishing feature between ISIS and Hamas is the fact that there are links, we can debate how directly, between different states and Hamas, especially Qatar and Turkey. This is obviously a very big question now in the moment. Do either of you have thoughts about what next steps there could look like, in terms of, getting them more on board or holding them accountable, especially now you have Hamas operatives seeking shelter in Turkey. Rory was between Doha and Turkey. What are your thoughts on the state aspect of the jihadi problem?
No one wants to take that. Uh, yeah, I mean, it's perverse in my opinion that Qatar is allowed to host the leadership of Hamas or the Taliban. It's something that the White House has, basically um, been willing to tolerate though for quite a long time. So to tell, say, Qatar, you can no longer host these people is, I think it's going to be a difficult sell, and um, I think that's regrettable. Turkey is also, well, just go to reiterate about, I know Qatar, of course, sponsors Al Jazeera. Al Jazeera is something of the mouthpiece of Hamas right now. It's a very pro-Hamas channel. So, I mean, that the difficult. I know there are people who in Washington and elsewhere who believe that we should, treat Qatar as kind of a state sponsor of terrorism. I don't agree with that, but when we have a massive air base there, but I do think there needs to be, a new approach with respect to Qatar. But I have a hard time seeing, this White House or even a future White House really taking that step, because it's a problem that, there's something that has been built up over time. Turkey, I have, probably less insight into. Erdogan is, of course, very outspoken in his support of Hamas. That has probably a lot to do with domestic Turkish politics. I think it was just a few months ago he was saying really nice things about Netanyahu. So, but there's a lot of financial funneling for Hamas that goes through Turkey that I think also needs to be cracked down upon.
Aaron?
I think it's going to be very difficult. I don't see any interest within the U.S. government at this point of doing anything related to Qatar or Turkey. Part of it is we do have a huge base in Qatar, but also Qatar is a huge go-between the U.S., Israel, and Hamas, just in general, but also when you're thinking about all these negotiations related to the remaining hostages. So long as there are hostages, I can't imagine the U.S. wanting to antagonize Qatar. And then in terms of Turkey, I just don't think it's as big of a deal for the U.S. In relation to it, since Hamas is bigger in terms of its financial networks, probably in Qatar and maybe even Lebanon as well, than in Turkey. And then also, the U.S. has a very complicated relationship with Turkey as well already. And we rely on Turkey a lot for things in Europe and what's going on in Ukraine, as well as stuff against Russia in the Black Sea. So from a strategic perspective, that's way more important than antagonizing them about maybe some financial individuals within Turkey itself. And then there's also, relationships we have related to Syria as well, even if that also is a bit complicated for a variety of reasons that we don't need to get into. But we are working together in some ways in Syria, the U.S. government. So, I think that, on sort of the priority list of things that the U.S. is interested in relation to its, partnerships with Turkey, some Hamas people maybe being based in Turkey is very low on the list.
Of course, it's very unfortunate, but it's the reality today. A final question, maybe for Aaron, before we turn it over to you both for final thoughts. What are the chances that the Gazan population will turn on Hamas? What does that look like?
I mean, at this juncture, probably unlikely. They're just trying to survive at this point for most people. Many people are starving at this point. So, they probably don't even have the capability to do anything. And the reality is most of them will view Israel as a greater enemy than Hamas at this juncture, just because of what's been going on the last 3 months. It's plausible prior to 10/7 that maybe if Hamas continued to govern over time, there would have been more protests against them due to the failure of their governance project and the fact that a lot of the population was angry with them for a variety of reasons. But right now, I just can't imagine that at all.
I would just add to that. I think, when we look at these polls about dissatisfaction with Gazan government, you know, that had a lot to do with failures of governance and administration. But I don't think that the Gazan people, they were opposed necessarily to the militant opposition to Israel that is embodied by Hamas, and we saw that as well as in polls in the West Bank and Gaza in terms of support for the 10/7 operation. Unfortunately, I think that you know there might be protests against, but there could have been in another an alternate reality protest against Hamas, but not for the reasons that say Israel would like to see protests against them.
That's a really important point of nuance, that the distinction between Hamas as a governing force for them versus any merit that they saw in Hamas's military actions against Israel. Interesting. We have another 3 minutes left. I want to turn it to you both for any closing thoughts. Maybe we'll start with Aaron and close with Cole.
Yeah. I mean, anything related to Gaza, Israel, Hamas, Palestine in general is extremely complicated. You know, it's not going to be solved in a 1 hour webinar, unfortunately. And, in terms of the discussion related to the jihadi movement in general, thus far, they've been irrelevant to what's going on. And, in the near term, I suspect that they will continue to try and take advantage of it from a propaganda perspective. But in terms of actually affecting things on the ground, it's unlikely, just because they aren't positioned to do so. Whether, some people that are disaffected in Western countries latch onto the message in the medium to long term, and that leads to plots and attacks, that's possible and likely on some level, just because of the long tail of this and the fact that this is sort of the longest conflict ongoing between Israel and Hamas, or Israel and Hezbollah for that matter. But in terms of, say, an al-Qaeda or ISIS seizing territory or anything along those lines in Gaza, or becoming the most popular Islamist group in this arena in the near to long term, it's hard to see now, at least.
Cole, in 20 seconds.
22nd. Well, I would just say that you're joking, right? I have maybe a little more. The Arab-Israeli conflict has a tendency to sort of overwhelm everyone's attention and perceptions, and kind of lead everyone to kind of view everything that's taking place in the Middle East through the prism of that conflict. And what I think makes that even worse of a problem is the way that all of these groups, the jihadi groups that we're talking about, they try to seize on all that attention and all those passions to exploit them and for their own causes. But it's important to understand, to disaggregate the various militant threats to this region. You have the Iranian-led so-called resistance axis. You have the Sunni jihadi movement. One of those, of course, is much, much stronger and a much greater threat strategically to the region, to American and to Israeli interests than the other, and that is the Iranian threat, I would argue. Now, 6-7 years ago, all people's attention was focused on the Sunni jihadi threat. And it may be that in another 6 or 7 years, we'll be not talking about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, because that will have subsided for some time, and we'll be talking about something else. It could be another iteration of ISIS. It could be, who knows? But I think it's important when we talk about all of these conflicts, not to see everything as through the prism of one thing. The Middle East is very complex. What's going on in Iraq, what's going on in Afghanistan, what's going on in Iran does not necessarily have all that much to do with what's going on in Gaza, despite what a lot of people are trying to portray.
It's very important about disaggregation, and obviously extremely complex, but very important for the United States, for Israel. So we're just so grateful to you both for your time and sharing your insights, as well as everybody who joined by phone and by video here. Thank you all for your time, and wishing you a good rest of the day. Thank you.
Thanks.